Professor Williams, welcome to Anti-Racism Live.
Well, thank you for having me. Pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Can I firstly ask you, Professor Williams, could you tell us about your work and mission?
I am the faculty chair for the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy program here at the University of Arizona College of Law. We recruit Indigenous students not only from the United States and Canada, but from around the world. We offer 3 degrees for lawyers, the JD degree, the LLM, and the SJD. And our mission is to bring Indigenous students from all over the world to study here, to do research, to work in our clinical programs, to learn how to promote and protect Indigenous peoples' human rights. And we've been doing that since I've been here for almost 40 years.
Can I ask you, why is the 21st of March the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination so important to you?
Well, first, the background. 21st of March is the UN Day on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination because on the 21st of March in 1960, police opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration in Sharpeville, South Africa, against the apartheid pass laws. And in 1966, the UN General Assembly called on the international community to redouble its efforts to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination. And for our program focused on issues of racial discrimination and racism against Indigenous peoples, that's a very important day for us.
Professor Williams, thank you. So the 21st of March, as you said, the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Anti-Racism Day. Where do you feel the global community is in relation to eradicating racism?
Well, with respect to Indigenous peoples, there's been some positive steps taken in the past 40 years since I've been doing this work. As both a researcher and teacher and human rights lawyer, in 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was the first international standard passed by the UN that focused specifically on the rights of Indigenous peoples, guaranteeing rights to self-determination, guaranteeing rights to free, prior, and informed consent, property rights, cultural rights. It was really an attempt by the United Nations, and after 20 years of activity on the part of Indigenous peoples at the UN, to get the UN to recognize, and the nations of the world to recognize the distinctive nature of Indigenous peoples' rights. We are land-based peoples, and our human rights are tied to our connections to our lands. And it's, in fact, the idea that Indigenous peoples are somehow racially inferior, are savages, are backwards and lawless, which had provided excuses and justification for colonial nations in particular to justify their taking of Indigenous peoples' lands and their denial of rights of self-determination, culture, and property. That declaration has had a significant impact. We've had a number of UN officials that have been appointed and UN bodies to investigate human rights issues involving Indigenous peoples. And from my experience, the human rights process works best when the voices of victims are allowed to express themselves, to file communications, to ask for investigations. So we have made some progress there, and I do attribute that mainly to the work of international human rights bodies like the UN. But our program here is unique. We host highest ranking UN official for Indigenous peoples' human rights, and that is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We see every human rights complaint lodged with the Special Rapporteur, and our clinics and our students and our faculty work on investigating those reports, on doing the research, on drafting them for review, and then finally submission by the Special Rapporteur to UN processes. And I can tell you the volume of those reports is very heavy. Literally dozens of significant documented reports of human rights violations against Indigenous peoples around the world are filed with the Special Rapporteur on a weekly basis. And so while that standard set by UNDRIP, by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is a positive step forward, the big challenge now is how do we implement those rights, not only in the advanced Western countries, but in other countries where Indigenous rights aren't even recognized at law.
So we're seeing an increase in racism, hatred, divided communities as a consequence of the global crisis that we're facing. I mean, what's your assessment of the latest situation, and can we turn it around?
Let me just address the specific issue that we've been working with the Special Rapporteur. The Special Rapporteur's first report to the UN General Assembly, all Special Rapporteurs, more than 20 of them, are required to issue an annual report on the state of rights. There's a Special Rapporteur for women, for children. The Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Francisco Calizai, his first report was on the issue of protected areas and violations of indigenous peoples' human rights, and that was sent to the General Assembly in 2020. What was found in that report was, although that indigenous peoples represent less than 5% of the world's total populations, indigenous peoples protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity in forests, in deserts, in grasslands, and marine environments. And the connection to indigenous peoples' human rights is, if you look at some of the major climate initiatives to address the climate crisis, whether it's 30 by 30 or the establishment by UNESCO of protected areas, in most of those areas, indigenous peoples have lived, continue to live, require those areas for their continued cultural survival, their cultural identity, their practices. And what's going to happen, what we're seeing happening is that countries, particularly in Africa and Asia, motivated by this idea that indigenous peoples have no laws, they don't know how to protect the land, they don't use the land effectively, they get in the way of tourism. What we're seeing is a large number of violent evictions of indigenous peoples off their traditional lands as countries try to establish these protected areas, these UNESCO zones. What it's called is fortress conservation. It's a model of conservation that seeks to implement the 30 by 30 goals. For example, 30 by 30 is the global standard by which countries commit 30% of their lands and water resources to protection of biodiversity and climate control. And what we're seeing is a large number of countries in Africa, in Asia, even in Latin America, are essentially forcibly and violently evicting indigenous peoples off their traditional lands, all in the name of conservation. And I think that's where we're seeing the real crisis issue. We know that the climate crisis is the major issue of the 21st century, confronting all of humanity. And so the issue is going to be, will indigenous peoples be required to pay the price to try and tackle this gigantic problem that we all confront?
Professor Williams, given the breakdown that we're seeing in relation to the issue of humanity's survival, as such as that you've just spoken about, what do you think? I mean, do you think it's actually possible that we could live together side by side, irrespective of the colour of our skin, political views, or religious beliefs?
Absolutely. You can't do this work unless you're somewhat of an optimist about human nature and the ability of humanity to overcome its systemic biases and prejudices. I mean, we all carry those around. But what gives me hope is the dawning recognition, and this is really emphasized in research done by the United Nations, in the reports filed by the United Nations Special Rapporteur. Indigenous peoples are the most effective stewards of these areas that contain the world's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples have lived on these lands. If anyone knows how to preserve and protect those lands, to maintain the forest, to maintain the wetlands, it's indigenous peoples. And so I come from a scholarly tradition called critical race theory. My teacher at Harvard Law School was actually Derek Bell, who's credited with helping to create critical race theory as a study of racism. It really is a study of racism and how racism finds its ways into our laws and policies. And one of the things that critical race theory teaches is called interest convergence theory. And the idea is that the way that you can get majority populations to protect and promote the rights of minority populations like indigenous peoples is to find where their interests converge. And so what we're seeing, particularly in Western countries, I do have to give credit to the United States, to Canada, many Latin American countries, which now recognize that one of the keys, one of the solutions to the climate crisis we confront, to the biodiversity crisis we confront, is to rely on that traditional native scientific knowledge that's gained through observation and practice on these lands over thousands of years. So yes, that does give me hope. I think the more the world recognizes that indigenous peoples are part of the solution to our climate and biodiversity crisis rather than the problem. That's where the hope lies, I think, for indigenous peoples to continue to coexist and co-manage these areas that are so vital to the human condition here that we confront.
Professor Williams, thank you. Lastly, can I ask you, to the person feeling disempowered, perhaps unequipped to be part of the elimination of racial discrimination, what resources or organisations, books would you recommend they go to be informed, inspired and engaged? And perhaps how can we help you?
That's our mission, is to inform, educate, and inspire. We maintain 3 separate websites. The first one is easy to find, un.arizona.edu. And that focuses on the work of the United Nations Special Rapporteur. In fact, every single report filed over the last 2 decades by the 4 UN Special Rapporteurs on the rights of indigenous peoples, you can locate it on that website. You can locate country reports on the state of indigenous peoples' human rights in your own country. Most of the countries with significant indigenous populations have had country reports filed by the Special Rapporteur. Communications, human rights violations, it's a great resource. And most importantly, it's a great resource to identify what we call best practices. What countries in the world are working with indigenous peoples to co-manage conservation issues, to be engaged in ecotourism. You can find it there. The second website that we maintain covers and focuses specifically on developments with respect to climate change, protected areas, UNESCO areas, and that is indigenous.arizona.edu. And there you'll get complete coverage of the latest developments. We gather news reports, again, on best practices, on human rights violations. And another website we maintain is preservationpause.org, all one word, preservationpause.org. And those focus on that website focuses on the role of large multinational organizations like World Wildlife Fund, the US State Department, Wildlife Conservation Society, the European Union, countries like England and Germany. These countries, these organizations are the organizations that are funding many of these protected areas initiatives, conservation initiatives, 30 by 30 initiatives. And the human rights system and indigenous peoples themselves closely monitor how these organizations work with indigenous peoples. Are they promoting fortress conservation instead of condemning it? Are they requiring countries that engage in protected areas issues that might be practicing fortress conservation, evicting indigenous peoples? Are they recognizing indigenous peoples' land rights? Are they recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent to any project that might affect their land? And are they promoting indigenous co-management and indigenous ecotourism? Those 3 websites, un.arizona.edu, indigenous.arizona.edu, and preservationpause.org, are really great places to sort of start your research, inform yourself, get ideas on where hotspots are for violations of indigenous peoples' human rights and how you can write to various organizations like Amnesty International, to the UN human rights organizations, and be a part of change and actually educate yourself.
Professor Williams, it's absolutely incredible to listen to you, inspirational. We wish you the very best with the incredible work that you do. Thank you so much for being part of Anti-Racism Live.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.